All right, hello, my name is Brandon Fairfax, and today I will be discussing not only the health impacts of social networking sites, but more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the mental health impacts of social networking sites. Now, just to provide a brief outline and framework for our discussion today, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to first talk about a brief definition of mental health, and that being our emotional, psychological, and social well being affecting the way that we think, how we feel, and the way that we act. We must also define social networking, right? The employment of websites and applications to interact with other people or to discover with similar interests to ourselves. And then the four talking points that we'll discuss today is going to be the benefits and harms of social networking, also the common themes that we can deduce from social networking, the consequences and implications of social networking, and lastly, we'll give a brief acknowledgement to social networking, my stance on the topic, and then some closing notes. Moving into our first mental benefit of social networking, we'll talk about the social element, right? Platforms such as Facebook and Twitter provide their users with the opportunity to connect with their family and friends. This is a great tool. It has allowed families to reconnect from across the world, to stay in contact with friends, to establish business partners from across the town, across the state, across the country even, right? We can establish a lot of pathways from a very long ways away all through social networking. Now, also another benefit which is sometimes conflicting would be the identity element as well, right? Social networking has provided people with a virtual source of appreciation and self-worth. This can prove to be detrimental, although some individuals do find a better source of appreciation and self-worth online through social networking than they actually gain in person, right? Out in the real world. Something that they don't get in the real world, they're finding online. This can be conflicting, although if they get it here, that's wonderful for them. All right, now moving into our first harm of social networking, we'll talk about depression. Right, time spent on social media platforms by high school students was positively correlated with depression. Right, children who spend too much time on social media or social networking platforms creates a positive relationship between depression. Right, too much time is a bad thing. And there's also disproportionate posts on social networking as well. Right, if you look at the ratio between social networking platforms, you see that there are more negative topics than there are positive topics, right? And too much of a bad thing results in a negative state of mind, results in a negative disposition towards the world, right? This also relates to our news networks that are on TV today, right? There's just a constant bombardment of negative information being tossed at people, right? And then individuals with a negative disposition, right, or a depressive disposition going into social networking can even make the problem worse. And that moves into my last point of depressive predispositions, right? Facebook and Instagram posts tend to capture the best parts of one life, right? That might cause someone to question their own reality or their own life, considering why is my life falling apart? Why is my life such in shambles right now when I look on social media and all my friends are posting all these wonderful things, when in reality, the only things that we post on social media is the best parts of our life, right? We never post the arguments, we never post the conflicts or trials and tribulations that we face throughout our days. We only post the best parts. Moving into the next harm, that being addiction, right? Social networking services, or SNS addiction, is in fact a thing, right? It is an advanced form of psychological and behavioral dependence on social media. Now, recent studies from Indonesia have shown that some individuals within Indonesia use the internet for 5.5 hours a day on average, which would suggest that some individuals use the internet for longer than 5.5 hours, right? That is a primary sign of addiction, right? If people are on the internet, on social networking for any point in time over 5.5 hours, that is insane, and yet people use that as the reality, right? Now, lastly, the last point that I'll talk about with addiction is phantom syndrome, right? Commonly associated with single, double, triple amputees or quadriplegics, right? Where you You remember your leg, you remember your arm, and yet it's not there. Individuals who use their mobile devices too frequently may develop phantom syndrome, or PS, which is characterized by a frequent false feeling of vibration and ringing from their cell phones. I can't say that everyone experiences this, although I have, from time to time, experienced this feeling of I feel as if my phone is ringing or buzzing, and yet I don't have my phone in my pocket, or if it just didn't ring at all. And yet we use it so frequently, we know that feeling that we develop minor or severe forms of phantom syndrome. Now, moving into my last harm of social networking, that being cyberbullying. Some individuals think that cyberbullying is much like real bullying, right? Face-to-face bullying, right? Days of the past, right? But in fact, there are three primary differences between cyberbullying and in-person bullying. That first difference is talking about how the victim cannot escape cyberbullying because it stays, or it doesn't stay in person, right? It doesn't stay at school where they're being bullied at. If they're being cyberbullied, it stays on that cell phone, it stays on the computer for days, weeks, months, years. It stays there forever, right? Not allowing the individual to escape that source of bullying, right? And they become a victim far longer than a traditional sense of bullying would be. Now, that second difference is talking about how cyberbullying is witnessed by a very large audience through messages, images, and videos. Right? This is in a public domain and can be forwarded again and again, which results in the victim's experience and abuse on multiple different occasions, right? A constant bombardment of reminders stating, hey, is this true? Did this happen to you? Or, hey, tell me more about this picture that was sent around about you, right? It's consistent, right? Allowing the victim to never truly escape that victimhood of cyberbullying. And then our last point is talking about how because cyberbullying is generally used online, the comments and abuse is then stored forever, kind of relating to my first point as well, which leaves the victim in a constant state of abuse, right? Years and years down the road, the victim of cyberbullying may think back to, I really hope that no one's looking at that picture that is somewhere online, or I really hope that no one is reading that comment about me online because it's now stored forever. It never truly goes away. Now, from this information, we can deduce through common themes that social networking is more harmful for adolescents, right? If you're a young person, you're more susceptible to the harms of social networking as opposed to your older peers, right? The topics that we've addressed today consist of depression, addiction, and cyberbullying. However, the harms of social networking regarding mental health specifically continue in the forms of anxiety, narcissism, and even self-harm. Now, these are all topics that we have briefly discussed today through this presentation, and yet they do exist, right? And there are more harms that come along with social networking, which would tell us that there are more harms than good that come from social networking, at least in regards to younger people. Now, social networking has proven to advance negative experiences such as an insufficiency regarding one's life or physical appearance as well, right? That self-reflection based off of our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers' posts, right? Reflecting on those, suggesting that, our life isn't perfect or our life isn't what it should be because our friends are posting things that are just wonderful. And I only experience that once in a blue moon, right? When in reality, they do too. It's just the mental state of being exposed to negative things through social networking that makes us feel bad about ourselves or how we look, right? I'm talking about just in conclusion today, and in my position as well, we'll discuss the consequences and implications of social networking, right? It's fair to say that if adolescents are exposed to an unhealthy amount of time with social networking, the outcomes may prove more detrimental than beneficial, right? All that this says is that if you don't monitor your kids or your little brother's time spent on social networking, then they may slip into this really unhealthy relationship with social networking, being exposed to too much time on their cell phones, mobile devices, computers, and being sucked into this loop, right, which we talked about with Indonesia, some people spending more than 5.5 hours online, which is incredibly unhealthy and results in addiction, right? We don't want that for our little brothers and sisters or our children someday, which would tell us that we need to sit down and discuss the negative harms and implications of being on social networking, right? Evidence from the suggestion is going to be from that there is a positive correlation between high school students who spend time on social media and that being linked to depression. But also, we talked about how individuals in Indonesia use the internet for 5.5 hours a day on average. And then lastly, we talked about cyberbullying as well and how it results in the victim having to experience the abuse of cyberbullying continuously, right? It's ongoing, it never ends for some individuals. And then briefly talk about my perspective on this topic. I do agree with the points that I've discussed today. I do feel like there is a need for monitorization, right? A sit-down talk with our younger individuals, these adolescents who may not know necessarily the harms that come from social networking, right? They need to be sat down and talked to and really described the harms that come from social networking and from social media platforms, right? And too much time is a bad thing, right? And how you need to be aware of cyberbullying and the things that you post, and the list goes on, right? And there is a very complex side to mental health as well, right? There's been information gathered on social networking since the inception of it, right? We can talk back to the days of MySpace and how it started off as this really cool platform for younger people to connect and exchange information, kind of like a diary or a journal, and yet it was online and published for the world to see. Now, this was all good and grand until adults started to consider, there's bad people out there who also make MySpace accounts and could be talking to, my children, or could be talking to my children's friends, right? This is when the topic got very dangerous and very scary for a lot of people, right? But since then, we've been gathering information on this topic, and our knowledge base on social networking has done nothing but grow and grow and grow to the point where we have so many publications and so many resources to combat the harms of social networking as well. And then just to leave with a brief disclaimer, right? Mental health is not my field of study, nor do I have the appropriate credentials to claim absolutes regarding the topic. What I had discovered from my research had co-aligned exactly with how I approach social networking and its connection to mental health. Right? So thank you for your time, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.